What's up guys, Lifting here. In this video I'm gonna break down the most important and interesting or impactful changes coming in 3.6. It is the patch notes, the quick and dirty. Remember to hit that subscribe button as I will be having plenty more PoE content coming out over the next many weeks. Let's jump right into it. And we're gonna start by just giving a brief overview. In the Synthesis Challenge League, you will meet Kavas, a lingering spirit who has lost his memories. He needs your help to piece together his past and discover the secrets that have become isolated in his mind. Help Kavas by exploring those lost memories and activating the memory stabilizers contained within. Successfully stabilizing the memory will allow Kavas to store it for use in the memory nexus. In the memory nexus, you can use your stored memories to build a path to distant memories. Distant memories contain great challenges and valuable rewards. And that's pretty much what this league is about. But let's talk about the new skill gems that are coming out. And we're going to start with the active ones. The first of which is Purifying Flame. A wave of divine fire deals damage in a line, then creates consecrated ground and deals damage in an area around the targeted location. A larger shockwave then expands outwards, damaging enemies standing on consecrated ground that were not already hit. The next is Soul Rend. Release a projectile that moves towards and passes through enemies, dealing chaos damage to enemies it hits and leeching a portion of that damage as energy shield. This projectile also applies a short duration damage over time effect to enemies around its path. The third gem is Bane. Apply a debuff which deal chaos damage over time as well as any linked curses to enemies in an area. The debuff deals more damage over time and lasts longer for each curse Bane applies. The fourth gem, Wave of Conviction, sends a rolling wave of energy forward in a widening cone for duration, dealing physical, fire and lightning damage to enemies it hits, and applying a debuff which lowers enemy resistances to the element of which the most damage was dealt for a longer duration. Casting the skill again while a wave is active will cancel the first wave. You can only ever have one wave. Next up we have Salutary. Cast an aura that causes you and your allies to deal more spell damage and grants increased critical strike chains with spells. You and your allies may also create consecrated ground when you hit strong enemies. The sixth gem, Divine Ire, deals physical damage and lightning damage to nearby enemies and grants stages while channeling, granting additional stages based on nearby enemies you damage. When you stop channeling, unleash a powerful beam of energy in front of you, dealing more damage per stage. I feel like we've heard that before. The seventh gem, Malevolence, casts an aura that grants increased skill duration to you and your allies and causes you and your allies to deal more damage over time. And that was the 7 active skill gems, but we also have 3 new support gems, the first of which is the Energy Leech support. Supported skills leech a portion of the damage they deal on hit back as energy shield. Supported skills also deal more damage while you are leeching energy shield and while you are on full energy shield. The second of the support skills is Intensify. Supported skills have less area of effect but deal more area damage per intensity. Supported skills gain intensity when used and lose intensity while moving or upon teleporting. And as for the final support gem we have Unleash. Supported spells gain seals over time and are unsealed when cast, causing their effects to reoccur for each seal lost. And that's it for the new skill gems, but fret not, there are lots and lots of older skill gems that have been reworked and rebalanced, which we will get to in a moment. But as for the other major content additions, we also get the pleasure of experiencing lots of new music in the early acts, some of which I believe I've actually already listened to, and it was pretty damn good. There will also be 5 new hideouts to unlock. We will get 17 new unique items, 15 new divination cards, because why the hell not, and 2 new item types, the fractured and synthesized items. Now let's talk character balance. You can now leech energy shield in a similar fashion to how life leech is done. The Ghost Reaver keystone now also doubles your energy shield leech rate. They have removed the minimum and maximum limit for critical strike chains, meaning you can have 0 critical strike chains and 100% critical strike chains, as opposed to where 5 used to be the bottom and 95% used to be the max rate. You can now have 100 and 0. There's now a limit to how far you can take your maximum resistances, and it is 90%. Anything above that has no effect. And I'm sure that a lot of deep delvers are taking note of this right now. Consecrated Ground now affect both allies, providing life regeneration, and enemies, causing hits against them to have 100% increased critical strike chance. We also have two of the ascendancy classes, namely the Trickster and the Inquisitor, receiving some pretty big changes. The Trickster's Swift Killer Keystone now also causes you to gain a power or frenzy charge each second while channeling, making it easy to sustain charges even during long boss fights. Ghost Stance has been completely reworked. It now causes you to gain a Ghost Shroud every second, up to a maximum of 3. The more shrouds you have, the higher damage reduction you achieve. When you get hit, you lose 1 instance of Ghost Shroud, but you recover energy shield equal to 5% of your evasion rating, plus you have a 5% chance to evade and 10% increased movement speed while you have energy shield. Escape Artist has been reworked. It now grants 12% increased attack and cast speed per Ghost Shroud, cannot be stunned while you have Ghost Shrouds, and 20% chance to dodge spell hits if you have energy shield. And finally, for the Trickster, the Prolonged Pain Keystone now grants 20% more damage over time, up from 15%. As for the Inquisitor, Sanctify has been renamed and completely reworked. It's now called Sanctuary and now causes Consecrated Ground you create to apply 10% increased damage taken to enemies. You have Consecrated Ground around you while stationary, and 15 mana regenerated per second while on Consecrated Grounds. The follow-up Keystone Pious Path has also been reworked and now grants 20% increased attack and cast speed while on Consecrated Ground, effectively a nerf of 5%. Consecrated Ground you create still grants immunity to elemental ailments, but now also provide a whopping 200 energy shield regenerated per second while on Consecrated Ground, and Consecrated Ground you create lingers for 4 seconds, which I take as meaning Consecrated Ground generated this way will be a very reliable form of sustaining the effect, as opposed to before, where you would quickly move away from the buff as soon as you started to run. And there's definitely something to be said about Eldritch Battery here too, but I won't. Now the Slayer Ascendancy also received a bit of a change. For instance, you no longer get 20% increased damage while leeching, but instead you get 30% increased area of effect if you've killed recently. This is a buff of 10%, it gave 20% before, and you now also get 50 reduced maximum recovery per life leech, which is in due relation to the new life leech mechanics. And now let's talk skill gems again. This is by far the most exciting part in my opinion. We went over the new ones briefly, but there are lots of interesting buffs and nerfs and reworks to the existing ones too. There's also a lot of not very important or impactful changes, and I'm simply gonna ignore those. So if you are wondering why I'm not mentioning that, it's because I don't think it's worth mentioning here in the quick and dirty. So we're gonna start with the two biggest reworks, namely the Flame Totem and the Stormburst skills. Flame Totem has been renamed. It is now Holy Flame Totem. This totem now creates Consecrated Ground at the totem's location. This Consecrated Ground also grants curse immunity. And instead of pure fire damage, it now deals physical damage and converts 50% of that into fire damage. It has also received a nice early game damage bonus and a decent late game damage bonus, with an additional increase of 5% damage effectiveness, up to 30% now. And instead of gaining extra projectiles as it levels, it now fires 2 additional projectiles at all levels, with these firing in a wider cone than previously, meaning it can hit more monsters at a time. It now has 20% more totem life, which is to make up for the fact that the gem quality now grants 1% increased projectile speed rather than 1% increased totem life as it did previously. Projectile speed is good for Flame Totem, as it means the projectiles can reach further, thus hitting more enemies. And then finally, and very interesting, Holy Flame Totem. It sounds like I'm about to say like holy shit. Holy Flame Totem is now considered a channeling skill and can thus be modified by relevant notables, items, etc. Yeah. Definitely a buff for the otherwise rather outdated totem, but it's hard to say if the damage increases enough for it to compete with other totems at high level. One thing to note is the early damage buff. plus the fact it has 2 extra projectiles from just the early levels, which could make it a powerful leveling skill once again. The next reworked skill is Stormburst, a skill that flopped pretty hard in the past, but it sounds like it may be coming back with a vengeance. Now Stormburst, it no longer fires projectiles, which probably means that projectile modifiers won't affect it anymore either. Instead, it now creates orbs of energy while you channel that repeatedly jump towards the target location until their duration expires, dealing damage in a small area after each jump. When you stop channeling, all remaining orbs explode, dealing higher damage in a larger area. This explosion deals more damage based on how much duration remains at the point you stop channeling. A very interesting mechanic, as it means stacking duration modifiers is going to directly increase the potential damage output of the skill. The cast time has also been significantly buffed to 0.25 down from 0.65, and it is now much easier to sustain at both low and high levels mana wise. Instead of dealing pure lightning damage as it did previously, it now deals physical damage and converts 50% of that to lightning damage. Mechanically similar to the Holy Flame Totem change. It's now also possible to use it at level 12 rather than level 28, and it now gains additional area of effect as the gem levels too. The damage effectiveness have been nerfed from 40 down to 25 though. That's I guess notable decrease in damage effectiveness, but remember that the cast rate is significantly higher and that the duration modifiers are going to be able to scale the skill as well. And then there is the fact that it's mechanically an entirely different skill, so it's probably hard to compare to the version we had before. So we're going to take a look at the less ambitious but interesting skill buffs and nerfs as well now. And note that tons of skills have had their mana cost tweaked, but I won't really be talking about the mana adjustment changes from skill to skill. It's not worth mentioning every time. So first up, Anger has received a rather significant flat out damage increase buff. You can now cast Arc slightly faster with a cast time of 0.7 down from 0.8. It has received a minor damage nerf at low levels and a notable nerf at high levels, especially considering the damage effectiveness has also been reduced to 80% down from 90%. On top of this, the range at which Arc can chain has been reduced to 25 units down from 50, and this simply means that the Arc chains can't jump as far as previously, and this primarily influences people who are using it with mines, but of course it will be noticeable amongst everyone. Don't worry though, Arc, despite some notable nerfs, should still be perfectly viable and a solid skill to pick up with these numbers. Keep in mind there's a lot of caster generic buffs in the skill tree that we will take a look at later. Arctic Breath now has a cast time of 0.7 down from 0.8. Both the hit and cold damage per second has received some pretty significant damage buffs, especially at early levels, but also at late levels, especially considering that it also received a 20% increased damage effectiveness buff, taking it up to 80%. Armageddon Brand has received an all-around nerf to both activation frequency, but especially also to high-level damage, including a 15% nerf to its damage effectiveness. Ball Lightning now has a cast time of 0.75, down from 0.8, and has received a significant damage buff at early levels and some at high levels, together with a 5% damage effectiveness buff, taking it from 35 to 40. Blade Vortex, guys. This skill has flat out received a damage nerf, both directly via changes to its flat damage, but also with a 5% reduction in damage effectiveness. I personally don't agree with the damage reduction at early levels. I don't think that was necessary, and it's just going to make the skill more awkward to use at that point, but I can understand the high level damage reduction change. Also, as I said earlier, keep in mind that there is a lot of generic buffs to spells, especially when self-casting, that may make up for this, right? Bladefall, now there's a skill you don't see mentioned too often anymore, but it has received a direct flat damage increase at both low and high levels. Blight has received the same treatment, especially the early level damage should be noticeable, and on top of the damage buff, it can now reach 6+ to radius up from 4, meaning the area of effect potential of this skill got buffed by quite a bit actually. Contagion can now affect up to 40 targets per cast, This is up from 20, and this is actually a huge quality of life change for Essence Drain and Contagion builds. Previously you would risk casting Contagion on a big pack of monsters, and since it was limited to 20, there was the risk of some of those monsters not being affected by Contagion, meaning if you were to cast Essence Drain on them, it would just kill the monster and not spread, and that's a bit awkward. The cooldown for Convocation has been reduced to 4 seconds, down from 8. That's pretty great for summoners. Cremation has received some pretty significant damage buffs, especially at high levels, also considering the 20% increased damage effectiveness bonus. And it now also gains radius as it levels up with up to 3+ at gem level 20. Dark Pact has received an AoE buff, taking its radius of 24 and increasing it to 26, and a decent damage buff at both low and high levels. Discharge has received flat out damage buffs to all 3 elements, but most noticeably it have had its cast time significantly lowered, taking it from 1 second to 0.75, making it a more attractive skill to self-cast now, rather than necessarily just triggering it via other means. If it's enough, we'll see. It's pretty hard to compete with the trigger effects. And now here's a real kicker, guys. Essence Drain has received some pretty sick buffs. Mechanical changes to the skill first of all now makes Essence Drain explode on impact, dealing no hit damage, but applying the Essence Drain debuff in a small radius around the target. This effectively adds the AoE tag to the gem, meaning long gone are the days where you had to feel bad about picking up increased area of effect for your Contagion spell at the cost of it not having any influence on Essence Drain, so you're not wasting the passive points there. Essence Drain has also received a significant damage buff both at low and high levels. Oh, and it of course also had its cast time slightly reduced too. Overall, Essence Drain is looking very, very solid as a league starter this time around. I played it just before this league ended, and it was great then. Now it's godly. Ethereal Knives has received a very significant damage buff at high levels and an additional 20% increase to damage effectiveness, taking it from 100 to 120%. And the damage increase for Ethereal Knives at high levels is definitely so noticeable that we may see a lot of Ethereal Knives builds coming back again now. Next up, modifiers to explosive traps radius now also affect the spread of its explosions, and it gains additional radius as the gem levels, with up to 4+ at level 20 gem level. The damage, however, has been nerfed at both the low and high levels of the gem, but with a 10% buff to damage effectiveness too. Fireball has received a noticeable damage increase, together with another 20% damage effectiveness bonus too. And these two combined, this is making it a much more interesting choice to scale ignites with. Flame Surge has received generic but noticeable damage buffs. More interestingly, it now gains up to 9+ length at gem level 20. Flame Blast has received a slight damage nerf at low levels, but a decent damage buff at high levels, and it have had its damage effectiveness increased by 10% too. Freezing Pulse has received a significant damage buff at all levels, plus an additional 25% increased damage effectiveness, taking it up to 150%. This skill just keeps getting better and better for every patch recently. Frostbound now applies cold exposure to affected enemies rather than reducing the cold resistance. Unfortunately, there are no sources on what cold exposure actually is, so I can't really comment on that change yet. Frostbolt has received a nice overall damage increase. Maybe that means it's time to dust off the old Frostbolt Totem Hierophant again. Glacial Cascade, however, have had its damage nerfed by quite a bit actually. I think the nerf is primarily due to its combination with mines, as by itself it doesn't deserve that nerf in my humble opinion, but it could receive or achieve some insane single target potential when combined with mines. Hatred as something new now grants up to 18% more cold damage, but have also received a nerf to the amount of cold damage it scales based off the amount of physical damage you deal. Ice Nova now have had its cast time reduced to 0.7 from 0.8. The flat amount of cold damage it deals has been nerfed, but to compensate it now adds a certain amount of cold damage against chilled enemies. Its damage effectiveness has been reduced by 10%. Ice Spear for some reason have received an overall damage buff at all levels. The circles from Ice Trap now have up to 25% larger radius, with the addition of a general but very significant damage bonus at high levels, together with a whopping 60% increased damage effectiveness increase. Definitely something to take note of here. Incinerate now gains radius and radius per channeled stage as the gem levels up. Both regular and channel total area of effect has been buffed, and the gem has received a damage buff at high levels. Lightning Spire Trap have had its damage nerfed both directly via its flat damage, but also by receiving a 15% reduction to damage effectiveness. Lightning Spire Trap used to be the go-to single target addition you would use when you're using Stormbrained, and I think that's why we are seeing this nerf. Lightning Tendrils have received general buffs to both damage and area of effect, and a significant 30% additional damage effectiveness buff. You can now cast Lightning Warp slightly faster. Orb of Storms have received some pretty significant damage buffs at all levels, together with an extra 35% damage effectiveness bonus. This is making me want to try and scale this skill as a pure damage source rather than just for utility as you usually do, right? Interesting. Scorching Ray has received a significant damage buff too, but no longer lowers enemies' fire resistances. Instead, it now applies the fire exposure effects, similar to the cold exposure effect that we see from Frostbomb, but again, we don't really know what it is, so it's hard to tell whether or not this skill has gotten buffed or nerfed yet. Seismic Trap has received a general damage increase and also a 20% damage effectiveness buff. Shock Nova have had its cast time reduced to 0.7 down from 0.75, together with some fairly significant damage buffs at all levels, and literally doubled its damage effectiveness, taking it from 60% to 120%. I don't know, the skill mechanically still feels clunky to use in my opinion. I'm not sure the damage buff makes up for that, but we'll see. Shockwave Totem has received both significant increases to flat damage, but also a 40% increased damage effectiveness buff. Spark has received a damage buff at high levels, but more importantly, the same projectiles can now hit the same monster more frequently. And with the way Spark functions, this is actually, although indirect, a potentially big damage buff. Spectral Shield Throw? Nah, I can't do this. Stormbrained, similar to Armageddon Brained, have been nerfed via its regular damage, but also damage effectiveness. Stormcall damage have been buffed at all levels, and it has received an extra 20% damage effectiveness. Unearth, similar to Essence Drain, now deals damage in a small area around impact of the projectile, and can now also be scaled via AoE modifiers. It has also received some rather significant damage buffs at all levels. Then finally, Winter Orb have had its damage effectiveness nerfed by 10% and its general damage across all levels nerfed by a small but noticeable amount. And as for the Vaal skills, there isn't really that much to take note of. Some of them have been adjusted to fit the balance changes to their parent skill gem, but it's probably still worth mentioning that any of the Vaal impurity skills now gain 4% aura effect per gem level rather than 5% as it previously was, and that you now take 25% less damage rather than 25% reduced damage. Also, Vaal Righteous Fire have received a fairly big nerf to the amount of spell damage it buffs while active. It used to be able to buff spell damage by up to 39%, now it's 28% at gem level 20. But we're not entirely done with the skill gems yet. We had some pretty cool adjustments to some of the existing support gems in the game. Arcane Surge, for instance, now calls supported skills to deal up to 10 to 19% more spell damage depending on gem level. And this is a separate modifier to the one granted by the Arcane Surge buff itself. It now also has a higher mana multiplier, making it more expensive to cast or sustain, which can help trigger it too, right? Then we have the Life Leech and Mana Leech support gems. These no longer grants increased leech rate based on gem quality, but instead up to 20% increased damage while leeching. Then there's also the Onslaught support gem, which now grants supported skills a 10% chance on hitting to grant Onslaught for 3 seconds, meaning you can now trigger Onslaught via this support gem against bosses too. Besides this, Chain, Fork, Decay, and Innovate have all been numerically buffed. Some rather significantly, such as Fork, which now at high levels actually ends up buffing your damage rather than having a negative multiplier. But these are generic type of numerical changes. We're not going to talk more about that. Now I want to go over the changes in the skill tree too, but if we cover it in this video, it's not going to be a quick and dirty type of video. It's going to be a pretty slow and long video. So I'm going to skip over the passive skill tree changes, and I'm going to make a separate video for that, and I'll upload that not long after you see this video here being uploaded. Instead, I just want to quickly mention near the end that there are some important item changes that I think you should know about, such as enchantments. The ones you find in the labyrinth or you get in the labyrinth now have their own mod slot on items. They no longer use the implicit mod slot, and that has something to do with the new mods you can craft in this league, but it means you no longer have to be afraid of rolling over them in that way. Lore Weave now sets your maximum resistances to a maximum of 78, where it used to be 80, so it's a nerf, right? The Death's Oath, Death's Aura skill now deals 25% more damage per second. That's definitely noticeable. Spreading Rot, the jewels for Blight, no longer causes enemies hindered by Blight to take increased chaos damage, and instead now causes Blight to inflict Withered on enemies for 2 seconds per copy of Spreading Rot. So you can no longer use it to buff the damage of other sources than Blight. And then finally, the Poet's Pen now only triggers spells socketed within it if you attacked with that specific weapon. Previously, dual wielding the Poet's Pen would mean that you would trigger spells from both weapons with each attack, so that's definitely a noticeable nerf too, right? And that was it, the quick and dirty patch notes for 3.6. If you're curious about the changes that I didn't feel like mentioning in this video, you can find a link to the full patch notes below. I will be releasing a video featuring 5 solid league starter builds before the league goes live, so if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe. A big thanks to you guys over at Patreon for your support. I appreciate you guys. Good luck in 3.6. Thank you for watching, and bros, do you even nerd?